Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Jaway Ayub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation with Boris, Michel, and Paul Schweizer. They both helped create the This Is Not an Atlas book for collective Orangutango. The subject of this conversation surrounded the topic of cartography, specifically the limitations of traditional cartographies and how some people, including Boris and Paul, have been advocating what is known as counter-cartography. We discussed the relationships between maps and power, maps and the state, maps and capital. We even discussed how to become an occasional cartographer for those of you who may be interested. And finally, we discussed how can cartography help us understand our relationship to nature. As with most episodes, this is a conversation that started with one angle and ended up taking in multiple angles. And yeah, that's basically it. As I said, This Is Not an Atlas book is available as a free PDF. So feel free to check it out before, during, or after this conversation. Thanks for listening, folks.
My name is Boris Michel. I'm a geographer or a sociologist turned geographer turned critical cartographer. I am based currently in Berlin. I work in Halle, which is about an hour drive from Berlin. And a couple of years ago, I started to become really interested and fascinated by maps and cartography, their history, and the power they have, or the power of visual methods of visualizing to tell stories about our place in the world. And that was one reason why I became interested in maps and cartography. And that's, I think, one reason why we started a project that took us a couple of years to produce This Is Not an Atlas. So it was really a slow science project, which was really interesting, nice, and exhausting at the same time. And I would hand over to Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Joey, for having us. I'm Paul Schweizer. Me too, I'm a geographer by training. I'm also an activist and popular educator, and part of Collective Orangutango. Collective Orangutango is a group of mostly geographers, all activists and educators, artists. Mm-hmm. And we are working besides other methods, like strongly inspired by Paulo Freire's popular education. We're working a lot with maps, and that is, of course, because of our training as geographers, most of us. And a lot of what we learned with social movements in Europe and Latin America, and in the last year, 10, 15 years, we as I said, we did a lot of collective mapping processes with community groups, youngsters at universities, social movements, all around. And then some years ago, we got in contact also with Boris and started this Not an Atlas project. And maybe it's important to note also that Collective Orangutango is not like a fixed group, but we're a group of mainly friends and a lot of people that we collaborate with all the time as Boris. So we are, and all of those people make part of Collective Orangutango too. So that's also why the Atlas was published under the editors group named Collective Orangutango Plus.
Okay, so just briefly before even getting into the conversation properly, obviously say that the book is available online as a free PDF. I will link this in the blog post and in the description. And since we're talking about maps, which are obviously very visual, there's going to be some limitations as to how we talk about it, obviously in an audio format. So anyone who's listening to this, if they're interested, feel free to check out the PDF after the conversation. I want to start a bit by just saying why This Is Not an Atlas was pretty impressive for me personally. And I guess I'll give some background, and even this will be a bit limited, and maybe if I forget some stuff, I'll think about them throughout the conversation. I'm from Lebanon, as listeners know by now, and it's a country that has only two land borders, Syria and Israel-Palestine, the state of Israel and the state of Syria. Both of them are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to actually cross. With Syria, it's extremely difficult for, I suppose, obvious reasons, and with Israel, it's actually illegal. It's just not possible to cross. It's also anyway heavily militarized. And growing up in that context, I've come to understand this reality as very violent, essentially. Not in the beginning. In the beginning, I sort of just took it for granted that this is how things are. After, let's say, growing up, I would visit Europe a lot because my father is based in Switzerland, and then I would see in the contrast between how many Europeans view borders as essentially very porous things that we can even get rid of from time to time, or not even think about, let's say, compared to the borders that obviously I grew up with. And even this is a bit simplistic, but let's start with that. If one opens a map of the Eastern Mediterranean, usually you would have Lebanon, Israel, often the Palestinian territories, although sometimes even the Palestinian territories are erased, so we can talk about that. You have Turkey, Egypt, I suppose, Greece, Cyprus, and so on. And what this doesn't show is just how difficult it is to actually move from one place to the other across these borders. For all intents and purposes, it's actually pretty impossible unless you're in a very desperate situation, in case of seeing refugees crossing from Syria to Lebanon or to Jordan or to Turkey and so on and so forth. And what it also obfuscates, usually when I just open the map, what it doesn't show is how from one side of the Mediterranean to the other, it's easier to travel than from the other side of the Mediterranean to the first side, if you see what I mean. So if you're a citizen of Greece, of Cyprus, except if you're from northern Cyprus, of course, it's easy for you to go to Israel, for example. Whereas if you're from Lebanon, you can't. And if you're a Palestinian in Lebanon, that's even doubly difficult. Obviously, you can't even move in general. And I can go on and on and on. There is a sense of, the best example that I usually give is when I would go to the border in the south, so southern Lebanon, I would be closer to Haifa, where my grandfather is from, than I am to Beirut. And if the border wasn't there, it would be, I don't know, an hour drive, if that, maybe less than that even. And yet when we open a map, we don't see these things. We don't see that the historical links between some people who are now on one side of the border, let's say, with another point that's across the border, if you see what I mean. And I can give on and on more and more examples. I was thinking also of like migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. The map of Lebanon doesn't really matter in the first place. What matters is more like the routes that they can take in the first place because of the kafala system. And maybe I'll expand on this in a bit. But I was wondering if we can just sort of have some reflections on your part, given that you worked on This Is Not an Atlas. How do you think, what are your reflections on how maps usually obfuscate realities, like hide realities, rather than do what they are quote unquote supposed to? Most people, when they think of maps, they think of them, or at least I did, as some kind of representation of reality, right? It's neutral, it's objective, all of these in quotations, of course. Whereas the more we dig deep into things, the more we see that it actually hides, or it creates more questions than it actually answers, if that makes sense. So I just wonder if you can have some reflections from you, and obviously if we can then transition into actually talking to what does it actually mean to critically reflect on that and even challenge that.
Well, that's a lot to unpack there. I think we could go start from a couple of vantage points. Let me just say two words about what you just said. I think the point of erasing is extremely important. If you draw a line on a paper and claim that this is there on the map, you always erase other possible lines and lies and points. And it also erases stuff that you cannot easily turn into lines and points and areas. Those are the three things cartographers use. Or that are difficult to turn into lines or change the thing if you turn it into markers on a map, like memory, emotion, and stuff like that. And this drawing of lines is, I think, one central part of the power of maps. I think we will come back to the term power of maps and the different powers maps have later. But also, I think let's not forget that the power of maps is not only of erasing. It's not only repressive, but it's also very productive. It's productive on a very basic level to get us from point A to point B, and in a more complicated way in knowing who owns what land. It's important for property. It's important for establishing borders. You mentioned it's often important for producing spatial identities. Some of them you mentioned, producing a geo-body of a nation, as Michel calls it. So I think erasing is important, but also the production. It is really, really important. And I think the other point you made when you said that the maps don't matter is that we often talk about maps as those things in an atlas or on a wall or somewhere. But I think it's equally important to talk about maps as practice. The looking at maps, the using of maps to navigate, the use of maps to restrict access, to establish border regimes and stuff like that. So I think that it's important to keep in mind that a map means different things to different people. I think that's very important when we talk about counter maps and counter cartographies. So counter to what and counter by whom. So, and I think that's the point where it gets political when we talk about maps and counter maps, counter cartographies. So that would be 2 points on what you just said. I think there's your question also, but I don't want to talk too long, is if we talk about counter mapping, counter cartographies, we probably should also talk about what's the problem with maps. And I think you directed us into that direction. So why do we need counter cartography, or why is the claim of the Atlas and of many, many people before that cartography needs some counter mapping, some counter cartography, and I think we need to talk about counter to what again, and we should talk about why we don't want to make an atlas. But anyway, say it's so loud that we refer to the atlas we don't want to make. So I think if that's okay, I can say a few more words on that. But I think it helps to, or I think one different. I'm not part of Collective Orangutan, so I'm not coming from an activist background in the context of maps. So I'm coming from a more academic background. So my start with maps was really an academic discussion, that came from some kind of post-structuralist critical theory thing. And I think it helps to go back to, if we want to talk critically about maps and cartography, to an academic discussion in geography, in cartography, in history, that started somewhere in the mid-1980s and is often described as critical cartography. And that's a bit different to counter mapping. We can talk about that a bit more, but I think it's based mainly in academic discussion. Critical cartography can, I would say, be understood as a critical perspective on the practice and the discourses, ideologies of maps, and cartography, and the perspective that looks at maps and cartography as, you could say, powerful discourses and ideologies to produce a relation between us and the world and make sense of the world in a spatial way, or they are social texts, as one of the key authors called it. And I think that links to the empirical examples you gave at the beginning. Those are authors in the 80s and 90s very frequently looked at the role maps played for the formation of the nation state, pro-colonialism, imperialism, those historical contexts where cartography and mapping really were central to establishing control over territories and people. So I think that's an important tradition. So the critique of the way maps were used in the history of the state and colonialism. And from there on, the perspective also asked not only claimed that maps are text, but also asked what kind of texts are those? So what's so special about maps? So it's obviously not a text like a text we read, but it's a kind of a visual argument that has some special and spatial properties. And I think we can talk about that later on, the way they spatialize social relations, how they fix social relations, how they make social relations very seemingly easy and simple. It's just a line. So what the social relation of a border becomes just a black line of ink, easily understandable by everybody. So there's a lot of impact, I think, if you want to criticize maps, but counter-cartography, I'd say, my last sentence, doesn't stop at criticizing maps, but I would say it turns the critique into a practical perspective, into a critical engagement with maps, and it's really a call for making other maps.
Right. And that, maybe to catch up here, this can happen, I think, on so many different levels, because there's so much to challenge about traditional cartography. On first of all, probably on the level of what kind of use do we make, or do powerful actors make of cartography? So this traditionally, or the most clear image is, of course, maps that make part of the project of colonializing the world, or military campaigns, property ownership, nation state building, and all of that, right? So here it's really, it is not just that maps are evil, but the point is, what kind of use do we make of those maps, right? Then we can challenge traditional cartography, I think, on a level of content, like what is shown and what is not shown, as Boris said, and both in both ways, by showing persons, social relations in a certain way, or not showing them at all, this can become really violent, right? And then I think it is also important, when we talk about maps, to talk about aesthetics and ways of designing maps, like how are things shown, and to what kind of not only clear content, like facts, quote unquote, do this refer, but also like what kind of emotions do we provoke by certain aesthetics. And then something that's really important to us as collective orangutan, but also as activists, educators, is the production process of maps, right? Because in a lot of cases, in a lot of processes, mapping processes that we took part of in the last years, it is not really about the map. It is not about the product. It's basically about the process. And maybe that we don't, even after weeks of collective mapping, we really do not keep any map or produce any map or something that can be shown around or so on, right? So sometimes it's just a process, and all of this can be called counter-cartography, I think. So there are, just to give an example, there are good reasons to use completely traditional means of designing maps, but inside or as a tool in a struggle, let's say, of indigenous communities to claim right on their land. So there, maybe it's not about experimenting with aesthetics. It is the most powerful there could be to use a completely conservative map in terms of aesthetic and elements, like graphic elements. But it is of course the point of how to use, and it's a counter map in that sense. I think it's important to remember, because there's a lot of discussion now on can a counter map be used, let's say, a Google Maps cartographic basis. I mean, I try to avoid this, but of course it can. It is really about the use we make, and can a counter map represent national borders, administrative borders? Again, we try to avoid, but unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it is we need to produce a map that is easily readable to everybody. And in the situation that we are in, most people like easily orient themselves on a map if it's like north up, Mercator projection, national borders on it, right? So just to make that clear, we are not dogmatic on none of that. Maybe to give a bit of idea how we in This Is Not an Atlas, in the book, try to not define counter-cartography, but to give space and give a order to all these different contributions that we have in the book. We basically use put the really different, diverse contributions that we received on our call in chapters that go from counter-cartography as critique. So there's a lot of the academic background, counter-cartographer, critical cartographers, of course, that Boris mentioned. Then we have a chapter on counter-cartographies as self-reflection, because that's something that we think is really important, and that there's a lot of great work being done in recent years using maps, not just in representing state actors and capital, like big enterprises and so on, but to use maps to reflect on ourselves in the world, right? The way we relate to each other and to the world. Then related to this, of course, we have a chapter of counter-cartographies to show spatial subjectivity. And this is, of course, extremely important when we talk about marginalized groups, to use maps to create voice and to influence public discourses and to show those spatial subjectivities that are not seen in hegemonic discourses, right? Again, related here is we have a chapter on counter-cartographies to create visibility. Then we have a chapter on counter-cartography as education. So mapping processes basically in education, in popular education, of course, understood as a political activist practice also, right? And to build ourselves as a way of emancipation, and maps in educational processes to reflect on problems that we have in our everyday surroundings and so on. Then we have counter-cartographies to create political pressure. That's I think there's a lot of well-known examples for this. Counter-cartographies that show violence, repression, things like that, right? Then something that's really important also, as we said, as I said, our background as collective is a lot of working with social movements. So what we learned a lot from the Iconoclastistas, a collective from Argentina, is to use counter-cartographies to tie networks, to get together and share everybody's problems, struggles, and so on, and to put them together on a common map, and to create political alliances and things like that. And then the first chapter actually of the book, This Is Not an Atlas, is counter-cartography as action, tools for direct action. And this can go from mapping. I think we have in a lot of cities now mapping empty housing lots, things like this. So as a tool for action to go occupy spaces, reappropriate spaces. But that can be also like maps to organize for manifestations and things like that, right? Really strategical uses of maps in certain situations of political struggles. Yeah, I think I'd keep it here to not talk too long on that, but we'll surely come back here.
No, thank you both for this. Paul, you mentioned something really important about how maps can, or like the emotions that map can evoke, and I think that's really important and interesting, because often when we think of maps, it tends to be represented as such as like this is objective, right? Like it's an unemotional analysis that just represents reality and that's it. And if you're actually challenging that understanding, you might be the one being accused of either being too idealistic, naive, too emotional, or what have you. And so there's a lot there that would be quite interesting to get into a bit more. Would you mind just both of you just giving us some examples? Maybe it's just because, this is audio in the end for most people, and so it would be difficult to picture some of the maps. Can you just give us some examples of how or like, let's say, just some examples of counter-cartographies at work, let's say?
Of course. So this is not Atlas, it's a collection of, I think it's 40 projects, 40 maps. As Paul mentioned, we made a call a couple of years for maps, like probably six years ago or something like that, and we received way over 100 submissions. So really from 100 different groups, really an extremely broad array of different maps. So it's really difficult to kind of, it was a long process to decide for those 40 maps. And they are very diverse, so it's difficult to really say this map represents counter mapping, counter-cartography. So it goes in so many different ways. So I don't know, Paul, do you have a favorite from our atlas?
Maybe I would even start with as I just mentioned, a map from the section Counter-Cartographies as direct action. There is this map from the Alarm Phone project, which is a project. You can visit it at their website, alarmphone.org, I think. Watch the Mediterranean, which is a map that is basically an online map using web Mercator projection, again, satellite images, like really as a lot of online maps that we have nowadays. And what they do basically is to the alarm phone is a phone, like a phone number that anybody who's trying to cross the Mediterranean and get into distress on the Mediterranean could call, and ideally give them their GPS localization, and they would, the alarm phone team that's like 24/7 available, would use the localization to check who are the responsible border authorities, like what state is responsible for rescuing this distressed boats, right? And by doing so, they just basically save lives, right? And then they put all the cases they received, they put them on the map, on an online map. So you would see where boats got into distress, where they got rescued, where they got pushed back, and where, in the worst case, where we know that people died and how many people died out of it. So I just take this example because it is so banal in a way, and it just saves lives, right? Yeah, it's really touching to realize that.
I also have a favorite, but before that, I would we should say that counter mapping is not something that was invented by some white cartographers in Europe, but that and the term was developed in the context of indigenous mapping, and I think that's really important. So I think the one tradition is the academic critique of maps. That's really an important tradition. But at the same time, and starting a little bit earlier probably, but always difficult to find the root of something. In the 60s, 70s, in the indigenous groups, most famously in the northern territories of Canada, started using maps, and maps have historically been the tool of the oppressor. So they were used to govern people, to claim that's now Canada. And they started using maps made not by the instrument of cartography, but using oral history and other techniques and strategies to make maps to claim territory, to have your own map that then can be used in court to claim that this territory was stolen by a settler colonial state, or is claimed as private property by, I don't know, coal company, but historically it has been our territory. So I think that's a very important historical root of counter mapping. So really make your own, so kind of have other people draw the lines on the map, if you will. So cartography was an academic discipline by the state for commerce, capital, and so on, and to really take the power of the map, and the map is powerful in court and elsewhere, and appropriate in a way the power of the map to claim territory, claim land, and so I think that's a really important tradition of counter mapping. And we have a couple of examples of indigenous mapping in the atlas.
Yeah, and I mean, this is really important, and actually transitions well to the next question, because I wanted to ask if you can expand on how, let's put it this way, what is the relationship between cartography, or let's say established cartography, hegemonic cartography, with the state and capital? And this is like a very broad and huge question, but just as much as we can to kind of flesh it out a bit, so it's not too abstract for listeners. Is it as simple as, I wrote it down as like, rulers and exploiters need maps to rule and exploit? You know, it can be as straightforward, in my mind, it can be as straightforward as that. The example of Canada, I suppose, would be one example of how this is straightforward. But yeah, how would you explain that?
That's a difficult question, and I think one that would need really a closer look at some case. And I think rulers and exploiters don't need maps; they can rule and exploit without maps. And historically, they have. So, and I think there's some kind of tendency to say maps have been here with us for like thousands of years. So they are the tool of the state and of private property. And because the Romans had some maps, and 13th century China had maps, and so on. But I think there's a good reason for making the argument that maps became powerful much later in the 17th century, with a number of important transformations. The emergence of the nation state, so a new idea of a state that is linked to space and territory in a different way than before. So it's really linked to a specific European history, to the power of the map, and it's linked to the emergence of capitalism, or early capitalism. So maps became really something that became much more popular and relevant for not every day, but for commerce in the 14th century in the Mediterranean. So with the expansion of the early capitalism in the Mediterranean, and then later on when private property was mapped, and the territory of the nation state was mapped to have your border, but also to govern within, so that then the maps became a powerful tool for the modern state, and then for private capital. But I don't think that the link is too deterministic, and I think the idea of counter mapping is to but while critical cartography really focuses on the state and capital, I think cartography and counter mapping is not so much interested in the state and capital as the users of maps, but more in taking the map away and kind of counter the monopoly of state and capital power over maps and everything else.
And there also, I think it's important to realize that while critical cartography is still talking, and also for us, I mean, also from a libertarian perspective, it is always about criticizing national borders on a map. I mean, that's obvious, but we're really kind of, as Boris said, criticizing the cartography that emerged from the 17th century or so, and more basically, like when we talk about nation states, of course, a lot from the 19th century. So I think we need to look also on what is happening to dominant cartography right now, because it's changing a lot, right? I mean, with most maps in every day, and the most influential, powerful maps, of course, nowadays are not anymore the paper map, like static maps, but are online maps, as we know. So the actors behind those maps change. It's not that much about military and state institutions anymore. There's a lot of dominant yet crowdsourced or partly crowdsourced maps. And I think we need to stay awake to see what is happening here and what kind of cartography we are really talking about nowadays, and what kind of cartography we need to like apply our critiques on. But then again, I think, to come back to your question, the relation of cartography and the state, I think what critical cartography and then counter-cartography does a lot is, we could say it in the words of James Scott, when in his work Seeing Like a State, he mentions this, like maps are of course crucial instruments for seeing like a state, instruments of simplifying and making like creating legibility, and in order to control territory, control populations. So I think what we need to do as countermappers is to unsee like a state, and I think still mapping will always be simplifying, right? But we need to be conscious about the way in which we simplify, and the way in which this may violate the rights or feelings of actors that are part of that map or part of that territory and all of that. So I think it is a lot about like developing other ways of representing our world that are not state-centric, and to strategically use simplifications that are more go into a direction of the world that we want to create, right? And then I think that counter mapping in this sense really needs to commit to like acknowledging the uniqueness of certain spaces, like, you know, that we use icons to show something, but the icon is always the same. So it really maybe violently simplifies and deletes the uniqueness of every one of these cases, right? And then we need to commit, I think, to the ephemeral quality of what we're representing. I mean, in the time we create a map about, let's say, urban struggles in Berlin, the situation may change already completely, like the weeks or months that we take to produce that map. For a really simple example, right? So we really need to acknowledge this, that we're not representing the world as it is, but we're representing the world in a simplified manner from one point of view, like our specific point of view in a specific moment in time. And I think in this sense, we need to mistrust also not just dominant cartography, but also our own maps in a way. And this is kind of what I think we need to commit to as critical and counter mappers. And then maybe the most important point really is to not map from above, not map anybody without their consent, and to preferably map together with communities, with the subjects that are represented on the map. And there again, if maps are a tool of state power, of capital power, then we just need to turn this around and make it a tool for popular struggles and marginalized perspectives and so on.
The question of consent is pretty crucial here, I suppose, because a lot of now, at least in my own personal story, let's say, I've been thinking more about the land back movement, indigenous land back movement, and I will do an episode that's dedicated with this, with like activists who are directly involved. So this, our conversation here is more like maybe an introduction to another one later on, because a lot of the I'm not going to speak from authority here, but my understanding is a lot of traditional way of conceiving one's territory or one's home wasn't necessarily as rigid as we might think, as maps, let's say, or lines on the map, let's say. That being said, we already did we did talk about this quite a bit, so feel free, we can skip this if you don't want, but I wonder if it's possible to talk a bit more about how can traditional cartography, I don't know how to call it, established cartography, let's say, usually how people think of it, how can it affect those being mapped without their consent? So I mean, indigenous groups, I guess, would be an obvious one, although I don't want to presume the knowledge or lack of knowledge of listeners. So if we can talk about this anyway, and I'll see how to then link it to because I do have some examples of my own personal experience from Lebanon as well, but I would like to hear your thoughts on this first, if that's okay, of how can cartographies usually, how have they affected those being mapped without their consent? And I know this is also a broad question at the same time.
Yeah, I think historically it made populations governable by the state. So the state used maps and statistics and whatever to know where people are in order to govern, so without their consent. I think the issue of indigenous mapping, without me knowing too much about it, but I think the dilemma is, in order to claim your territory, you have to speak in the language of territory.
Yeah.
And not speaking in the language of territory was one kind of strategy to that was used by settler colonialism to get the territory, because the indigenous groups didn't claim the territory as their property, because property is a different concept. So in a way, those groups had to submit to the Western concept of territory and property in order to get their land. So I think that's a dilemma, because in the court of law you have to speak in the language, and I think the groups used it strategically to claim territory, and often, in some cases, really successful, as in the case of northern Canada. And I think there's a tension between indigenous epistemologies and the cartographic rationality or gaze. And I think the other forms of indigenous mapping cartography tried to develop new strategies of representation. But I don't think that they help in the court of law so much. But they help to I think that's really important to if we talk about counter-cartography, it challenges the aesthetics, it challenges cartography as simply drawing lines and only having lines, points, and areas, and really thinking beyond the map we know from school. Really thinking about maps as means to represent some relations between people in space. So really as a text, that kind of deals with spatial complexity. And then there are multiple ways, many more ways to do that. But it always depends on what's your aim. If you want to use it to claim something from some powerful entities, you have to often speak in their language. And we have, I think, different examples in the book.
And then maybe also to bring it back to your question, like the kind of violence that the traditional cartography does to people. We talk about indigenous territories. It's rather obvious, or being like also urban populations being displaced because of property conditions, all of that. But then also think of a case that I work, a context that I work in a lot with urban youth, let's say, that would like they come out the metro station in their peripheric neighborhood and look at the map there. There's the map of the neighborhood. And that map just does not represent their neighborhood in the sense of course, there's the streets and things, but then the relevant institutions on that map are not relevant at all to them.
Right.
And relevant ways or meeting points or really spaces of their everyday lives are not on the map. And this is where we, I think, need to reappropriate cartography from our everyday lives perspectives. And this is also what we see in collective mapping processes, like the moment in which we ask people to or we ourselves put our claims on the map, it changes. There's a different feeling for it, because as long as it's not on the map, it's like, yeah, I would like to have a playground or a soccer field in my neighborhood, but who cares? But then you have some youngsters putting this soccer field on the map and present. And I had this situation and several times, and then asking them to present this map with their claims for their neighborhood in a public conversation with local politicians or so on. And they like really the way in which they talk, the body, and the way in which they stand there in this like rather uncomfortable place changes completely. It's on the map. It's real. It's relevant. It's legitimate.
Right. I mean, okay. So even on that note, like if we want to think of how to encourage or promote more what we're calling like bottom-up approaches, right? There's a really amazing section in the book, I think you call it How to Become an Occasional Cartographer. And, if one of the primary aims of counter-cartographies is, and I have a quote here, the use of maps as tools for the production and visualization of geographic knowledge, end quote. So from what I understood, this is precisely what critical geographers, cartographers, etc., were skeptical about when it comes to most maps. And I think we definitely discussed this, like we went through this in this conversation. And in other words, like most maps claim to represent something accurately, in quotation, objectively, in quotation, etc. And critical geographers disagreed with that. Okay. So with that in mind, how can occasional cartographers change that? And let's say myself or even listeners, hopefully, who knows, are interested in becoming occasional cartographers. What are certain things that they can, other than read the book, which I would recommend that they do anyway, what are certain things that, they can think of or they can work on and so on?
No, it's nice you mentioned this, because it's really also for me the manual part, how to become an occasional cartographer, is the part that I really love in the book. And it is basically, let's say, the project of Collective Orangotango is to popularize cartography, right? Or to come back to the terminology that Boris suggested. If cartography is, if maps can be understood as text, then we would say we need to, or what we would like to achieve, also with not an atlas, is a cartographic alphabetization, in the Paulo Freirean sense of alphabetization, not just of reading the map, but of critically reading it in relation to my everyday life, and to the spaces that I live in, and to be able to do the two things, right? To read maps critically, and to produce maps ourselves. And I think for me, it is not like critical cartographers, counter mappers have done a lot to develop other ways of doing cartography. But I'm really looking forward to see a lot more diverse groups doing maps, and doing maps in different ways, and not just as we do in a lot of workshops, like putting icons on paper maps, which is really like close to what traditional cartography was, but to engage other forms of knowledge in other forms of creating maps, other materials also, like use textiles. There's some examples of that also in the book. Use sound, non-visual modes of mapping is something that interests us a lot, because other sensations, of course, can appeal to other forms of knowledge and emotions also. I would like to be able to do maps, create maps with smell, also something that is still seems nearly impossible, but we may find ways to do that. So I'm looking forward to have everybody participate in this project of all of us being occasional cartographers.
Yeah, but I would totally agree, and let's all become those occasional cartographers. But I would, because you said, isn't that kind of a contradiction to what we said before, that maps are dangerous stuff? They essentialize, they fix. It's so difficult to be ambivalent in a map. You have a line or you have not a line. So it's really, the cartographic gaze is from above. It's kind of the map is the view from nowhere, in a sense. So it's really simplistic. Dennis Wood put it nicely somewhere that what he hates about maps is their certainty. They really know the stuff, and you should be skeptical about people claiming they know what it's all about. And it's difficult to be vague in a map. So I think beyond being an occasional cartographer, you also should be a skeptical cartographer, or remain a skeptical cartographer, and not only be skeptical about other people's map, be skeptical about your map. I think reflexivity and positionality are key to critical cartography. And I think it also means to think in every case, when you would like to do a map, is the map a useful tool? Is it helpful? Or what can maps can do a lot of harm, and your map can do a lot of harm. And if you want to address your topic by maps, you should think about if a map is a good tool or not, if it's dangerous. So, and I think that there are topics where I can't think of a good use of maps. I think mapping crime, for example, I don't think that crime mapping can be helpful. I think it's always ideology what's produced, because you spatialize something, and that's always take something away. So really be skeptical and make great maps.
Yeah, like in that example, you would always have a specific definition of crime, which usually doesn't include stuff like environmental crimes or financial crimes or other stuff. It's usually limited to, I don't know, property crime or theft or that kind of stuff usually. I have a couple of more questions. I'll ask the last one first, actually, because it's related to what you were talking about now. Like, the both of you co-wrote a paper last year, I think, or released it last year anyway, which is entitled, this is going to be complicated, This is Not an Atlas, an Atlas, on the pitfalls of editing a global collection of counter-cartographies. Okay, this was a mouthful. As a way of critically reflecting on the book, obviously, and the practices behind it. And given that, Boris, you just mentioned that even occasional cartographers have to be, it's not just that like your intention has to be good, which, maybe is step one, but there are certain things to take into consideration and whatnot. So I'm just curious, like, if you can tell us what were some of the conclusions of that paper, like, this is not an atlas, and if yes, what does that mean? If no, what does that mean? Go for it.
I don't think we answered the question from the title, to be honest.
Fair enough.
But I still like the title.
The open question.
But look, the paper was part of a theme issue of a journal, that is really cartography. And the special issue was on decolonizing the map. And we saw the column and thought, that's a great opportunity to think, because we claim This is Not an Atlas is a global collection. So we claim some sort of universality, which we are skeptical about, but nonetheless, it's somewhere in the title. And there's a map there's a map of the world on the cover of the book. So we play with that a bit, but nonetheless, it's a bunch of white, mostly men, all of them somehow related to German academia, so making a global map with a lot of decolonial content, but nonetheless, something we should reflect on. And we had some great feedback, and the book sold phenomenally. So it was a success, but we had some some reservation by people, primarily from the global south. And what a book like that represents, what kind of, it's a 5 kilo heavy thing that's really looks beautiful on a coffee table, but it's probably not useful in many other contexts we didn't think about. So a lot of problems, or some problems emerged, and we asked ourselves how we would approach the project in a different way if we would have done it again. For example, what we discussed earlier, almost all the maps we have in the book, in a way, have a Cartesian space. There are some grids, some lines, and so we don't have any non-Western concept of space in the book, and we don't know how that would work. We don't know any people who do it, so there's a reason why it's not in there. But how could we engage with other epistemologies and spatial concepts and stuff like that? I think that was one important question.
Yeah, and then I think we also addressed something that really came up after after publishing the book is the materiality of this book, like the heavy book, where it looks beautiful on a coffee table. It looks beautiful in a book place, in the library or wherever. But it's not so practical if you want to go out with your backpack, take the metro, and bring it back to the streets if you want, right? So really, this is something we reflected on, like what kind of publishing makes sense. Of course, we're happy to have it, the open access PDF and the homepage, the platform where you could access all of this without buying the book and without carrying the book around, but still, and then it's all in English, right? This is something that we're not so happy about because it excludes a lot of people, of course. And then I think what remains of This Is Not an Atlas is really, it's not that much a book. Like for us now, it's not basically a book the book is just one artifact that we produced on that way, but it's a global dialogue in a way. For us it is, because it's not that we as editors are this let's say genius creators of a beautiful book. It's not about that. We're really humble learners in this process of dialogue with counter mappers and critical cartographers from a lot of diverse different places, and we are so thankful to be part of that. And what we want Not an Atlas to be is a platform, a medium where this dialogue can continue. So we're still asking everybody who's producing critical maps, who's counter mappers, to get in contact with us, to publish their works on notanatlas.org, to share experience, to meet up hopefully in one day again, and to go on in this dialogue basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair enough. Acknowledging your own limitations, they're going to happen in any kind of project, I think. But yeah, this is definitely important. So, okay, I had one last question, if that's okay, before we get into the book section, which is, I try as much as I can to always have a climate change component to any conversation that are not, I mean, some of the episodes are on climate change directly, obviously, but some of the others aren't. So the wildfires that we've been witnessing, around the Mediterranean couldn't care less about national borders. And yet our responses to wildfires, and I'm saying our in quotation, usually governments' responses to wildfires usually heavily do rely on these conceptualizations. If not for economic reasons, then it's for political reasons and so on and so forth. If a wildfire is happening, if it's the same wildfire essentially that's happening across the Eastern Mediterranean, the way it would be responded to if it's hitting, let's say, Lebanon would be different than if it was hitting Greece or Turkey and so on, which is exactly obviously what happened. There are lots of details we can get into. There's the issues of corruption, issues of government. It's not as important here. But regardless of all of that, if we are to be tackling something as all-encompassing as climate change, I would imagine, I would hope anyway, that there will be some component that critical cartographers, as we've been calling them, like that there's some role to play, that they have some role to play. So just also kind of a general reflection on your part, sort of kind of to wrap up before getting to the book section, if you can reflect on how counter-cartographies, in your view, can deal, in quotation, or can think about climate change, and how can be used to mitigate some of the effects of climate change, or to at least critically think about climate change in ways that established cartographies, let's say, usually don't do as well, maybe.
I kind of, just for provocation, would say that classical cartography is not so bad at that. Could be better, but cartographers love to put nature on the map in different ways. And I don't know about you, but I read a lot of National Geographic when I was younger, or Geo in German, and those are extremely cartographic mediums that use maps to tell us stories about nature. Different kind of natures. The tornado is threatening us, or we are threatening nature, or nature's just beautiful, or there's so many nice birds around and can map them and so. But there's so many ways maps can tell us stories about nature. And there's a really beautiful book by Dennis Wood and John Fels, Natures of Maps, where they have I think it's 10 different natures of maps. So the way maps talk about nature and produce nature. And I think that's, from a critical perspective, there is room for more critical engagement with nature. I think most of the maps portray nature as a thing out there we can collect, or and I think from a critical perspective, we would be more interested in human-nature relations as complex social relations. But I think there is a lot of important work already done in the more traditional cartography. And the point with maps are good for nations, but not for kind of the planetary scale. I totally agree on one point, but on the other hand, I think one could make the argument that it was really cartography that made it possible to think about the planet. Perhaps a bit an overstatement, but I think there's one story often told that in the 60s, when the first photo of or picture of the whole Earth emerged, that was the image of the early environmental movement, the whole Earth, and it shows us how fragile it is, how small, and how we are all in the same. So I think, and it's a way of it's not a map, but it's a cartographic representation. And I think that's really, the whole Earth is really a powerful symbol of interconnectedness. And I think that climate change is only representable on a global scale. I think cartography is really powerful in talking about hyper objects like climate change. So
yeah, and then
they are made for nation states, but they can help us really talk about in a different way about nature, our relation to nature.
And I would say that exactly this is something that I'm really keen to engage in, like to develop other representations of the planetary scale, right? Because we still basically use world maps that are New Zealand in the lower right corner and Alaska in the upper left corner, and that's it. And I mean, it's so there's such a lack of fantasy, also I think effect to this planet that we live on it, we are part of. And so I think we have to as cartographers, artists, we need to find new ways to represent the planetary scale. And I just remembered some workshops, some process that I was engaged in recently, together with Cristina Ribas from Porto Alegre. We claimed, that's also a provocation, of course, we claimed hydrocartography, referring to this debate, hydrofeminism debates that claim like to overcome anthropocentric feminist discourses also. And we try to engage this perspective in cartography, in mapping. And it's something that we really loved to, and which enjoying a lot, to think of, instead of cartography being so much focused on the static, the dry, the land, right? Be focused on the fluid element that connects all of us, that goes through my body, through the ocean, rains down, and all of it. And we claim that this is something that could be applied also on an aesthetic level to use, instead of, we talked a lot about the straight line, the straight demarcation that is so dominant in traditional cartography, to get rid completely of the straight line and say hydrocartography would use rather stains, drops, opaque shades of colors, things like that, to include the complexity of what we represent on our maps.
That's a
just to share some of recent discussions.
No, that's a really good point. And yeah, Boris as well, thanks for, it's not provocative, I think. I wasn't even 100% confident when I was asking the question whether it was accurate or not, but yeah, it is important. And yeah, no, it's a fair point to say that cartography can be pretty good at quote unquote representing nature, of course. And by good, we also say this in a humble way, that there will always be limitations, I suppose. Well, I mean, to enter the book chat, book section, if that's okay, what are 3 books that you two would recommend to listeners? And like just briefly say why, basically, if that's okay.
I would start with one book that was so important to us. It's rather a booklet, the Iconoclastistas Manual of Collective Mapping, Mapeo Colectivo, which is available on their website, iconoclastistas.net, I think, in English and Spanish. And it is basically a great introduction, also visually a beautiful introduction into critical mapping, collective mapping, and full of inspiring elements like icons that you could just copy and go on to map in your neighborhood or your village or wherever you live. So that was really important to us, and I still recommend it all the time. And then one really recent book that I'd like to recommend is Counterpoints, Atlas of San Francisco Bay Area, Atlas of Displacement and Resistance. It was just published like a month ago at PM Press, I think. It is a atlas edited by the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project from San Francisco Bay Area, and they are such. Their work is so inspiring in the sense of combining professional, academic cartography, digital cartography, analog mapping with community activisms, also with a lot of forms of activism, a lot of combining mapping with different artistic methodologies, and really making a change in building political pressure against gentrification, displacement in the Bay Area. So it's really inspiring, great work, and beautiful to have their work concentrated in this atlas.
I think one book when I thought about the 3 books, or when you wrote that we should come up with 3 books we should recommend. I think the first book I thought about was it's really a depressing book in a way, which I'm sorry, for Weaponizing Maps by Joe Bryan and Dennis Wood, and it's a history of indigenous mapping, which I mentioned it earlier, and I mentioned it as a very optimistic story. And the book looks at the history of indigenous mapping in the I'm not sure 80s, 70s, and 80s when it emerged, and when it became in a complex mix of academic and counterintelligence policies, part of US counterinsurgency in Central America, and not only that, but it also really corrupted, if you will, a lot of academic geography, or a couple of geographers engaged in military-funded critical cartography. And I think it's a really important book that highlights that none of that is innocent. And you mentioned the good intentions. Good intentions can be turned, and maps produce powerful knowledge, and sometimes you cannot control what the knowledge is used for. So, as I said, it's a bit depressing, but it's, I think, a great and very important book to again remain the skeptical cartographer. Another book, or a bunch of books, I think are really interesting, even though they are not too cartographic. But I think and Paul mentioned it with Watch the Map before, the work done by forensic architecture and forensics. And I think that's often extremely cartographic, often a little bit too technology driven, or I think their aesthetic is really a hyper technology aesthetics, and I think it's far away from what iconoclastistas would do in the style they make maps. But I think it's a very really important and powerful attempt to tell spatial stories and be reflexive and claiming to produce truth, but really being aware of your own situated position and so on. So I think that's, at least it's very inspiring, I think. And the third book is, I just mentioned, Natures of Maps. It's just a beautiful coffee table book with beautiful maps you can look at, and it's great fun.
I think we've proposed quite a number of beautiful coffee table books, including yours. Quickly on forensic architecture, I didn't work with them yet, although with Bellingcat, I interviewed Elliot Higgins last year, one of the founder of Bellingcat, and I will have, although it's not confirmed yet, the authors of an article that was published on Bellingcat called, I've opened it here, Yemen's Disappearing Date Palms, applied environmental OSINT, open source investigation, and how like basically environmental open source investigation, obviously you will use cartography to do that as well. So this is another example of how this can be used as a form of action. I mean, journalism first, but then people who read it can then use this as a form of action as well. So yeah, I mean, guys, this has been really very productive and informative conversation. I'm sure listeners would agree. I don't know if you have any final thoughts. Go for it, and if not, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for the podcast and for inviting us.
My pleasure. And listeners, obviously everything that we've mentioned, I will include those as links, including the recommended books in the end. I will mention those in both the description and the blog post. All right, Boris and Paul, thank you a lot for chatting with me today.
Thank you.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.